Have you ever wondered how many animal species actually live on Earth? You might guess around 8,000 or so, but let's look at the numbers. There are 6,000 mammal species, 9,000 birds, 10,000 reptiles, 7,000 amphibians, 30,000 fish, and a staggering 1 million species of insects. Our planet is practically dominated by insects. It is surprising that there are 160 times more insect species than mammals, which are often considered highly evolved. We might instinctively think that more evolved species would have greater diversity, but that is not the case. The secret behind this mismatch lies in their physical size. Larger mammals undergo mutations much less frequently, which limits their species count. In contrast, insects are tiny, making mutations more common and leading to diverse species. Generally, this incredible diversity is credited to three powerful traits: flight, metamorphosis, and diapause. These features allow insects to adapt and pass on beneficial traits to future generations. It is like they hit the jackpot of evolutionary traits. While humans might dominate as individuals, insects are undoubtedly the champions of species diversity. Yet, many mysteries still surround these creatures. For instance, despite their vast numbers, not a single insect species lives in the sea. They can conquer the skies, but why not the oceans? Even mammals and birds have adapted to marine life. With 1 million species, it is strange that they are strictly confined to land. Today, we will explore why there are no insects in the sea, along with 2 other major insect mysteries. Let's dive into our first big question. First, why can't insects grow into giant sizes? You've probably never seen an insect as large as a human. Let's compare the maximum sizes of different animal groups. The largest mammal is the blue whale at about 30 meters. The largest fish is the whale shark at 12 meters. In comparison, the largest insect is barely 25 centimeters, unusually small. You might think it's because larger sizes make flight impossible. Looking at their habitat is a great starting point. Generally, marine animals can grow much larger. In water, gravity is countered by buoyancy, preventing large bodies from collapsing under their own weight. On land, animals that grow too heavy simply cannot support their own weight. But what about the sky? The largest flying birds have a wingspan of up to 3 meters. So, flying isn't the sole reason insects remain small. What is the actual reason? Some people claim that if all creatures were scaled to the same size, insects would be the strongest on Earth. It seems like a missed opportunity that they can't grow larger to dominate the planet. There are 2 leading theories for this. The first is that they lack bones. Specifically, they lack a backbone. Invertebrates, which include insects, are generally much smaller compared to vertebrates with internal skeletons. Without bones, how do they support themselves? Insects rely on an outer shell to support their body. This is known as an exoskeleton. Think of it like a plastic pudding cup, where a hard outer shell supports the soft contents inside. In contrast, humans and other vertebrates have an internal skeleton. Does this mean they cannot grow larger because they are trapped in a shell? In simple terms, yes. As creatures with internal skeletons, our meat and muscles grow outward around the bones, making size less of an issue. But since an insect's muscles are inside its shell, trying to grow larger just packs the interior too tightly. And without their shell, they have no structural support to stand. But couldn't they just grow their shells larger as they develop? That is exactly why insects molt to grow. Because their skeleton is on the outside, they must shed it to allow their bodies to expand. However, lacking an internal skeleton is like having a building with only outer walls and no pillars inside. If it gets too large, it can't support its own weight and eventually collapses. Still, a maximum size of 25 centimeters feels remarkably small for animals. Have insects always been this small throughout history? Actually, ancient insects were much larger than they are today. This brings us to the second, more widely accepted theory today, and that is, insects do not have lungs. Without lungs, how do they breathe? They use a method called tracheal breathing. Insects have tiny holes on their bodies, and air tubes called trachea run through their entire system, like blood vessels to supply oxygen. So, insects are full of tiny breathing holes. And because of this system, insects do not have blood vessels, and their blood is not red. Why does a lack of lungs mean their blood isn't red? Human blood is red because hemoglobin in red blood cells uses iron ions to bind with oxygen and transport it. It's the same principle that makes iron rust red. But insects don't need a fluid system to transport oxygen. Oxygen travels directly through the tracheal tubes to the tissues, meaning their blood doesn't carry oxygen. Their blood is usually clear or pale green. So, that clear liquid when a bug is squished is actually its blood. Since it wasn't red, most people never realize it. But why does the absence of lungs prevent them from growing giant? Let's look back at how this breathing method scales. Insects rely on a passive physical phenomenon called a concentration gradient. This is where gas naturally diffuses to equalize its concentration, just like pouring milk into coffee and waiting for it to mix on its own. Oxygen naturally diffuses throughout the insect's body, without requiring physical effort. This respiration method is incredibly efficient because it doesn't consume energy to pump air, so they can survive with very low effort breathing. It's amazing that they don't need energy just to breathe. Maybe we are the strange ones for needing so much energy just to keep our systems running. However, because they lack lungs, they cannot actively inhale. They can only wait for oxygen to diffuse on its own. Therefore, if their body is too large, oxygen cannot reach deep enough, causing them to suffocate. As physical size increases, the surface area available to absorb air relative to volume shrinks. Passive diffusion only works well for small creatures with a high surface area to volume ratio. If an insect were to scale up to 3 times its current size, its volume and oxygen demand would increase 27-fold, while its surface area would only increase 9-fold, leading to oxygen deprivation. Conversely, if atmospheric oxygen levels are higher, they can grow larger. In fact, 300 million years ago, Earth's oxygen level was about 1.5 times higher. During that era, a giant ancient dragonfly called Meganeura had a wingspan of up to 70 centimeters. When oxygen concentration is high, even passive diffusion can sustain a much larger body. But couldn't they increase surface area by folding their shell, thereby maximizing oxygen absorption and growing larger? If they did that, their shell could no longer function as structural support. An outer shell with too many folds would lack the structural strength to hold up a body. So, changing the shell shape has limits. However, the idea of increasing internal surface area is exactly what lungs do. A human skin surface is only about 2 square meters, but the internal surface area of our lungs is about 70 square meters, enabling massive gas exchange to power our large bodies. In short, as insects grow larger, they lose the benefits of an exoskeleton, though perhaps it's for the best that they stay small and less intimidating. Let's move on to our second mystery. Why are there absolutely no insects in the sea? At first glance, this might seem like an easy question. Since they breathe through holes in their body, wouldn't they just inhale water and drown in the ocean? But look at whales. They are mammals that breathe through lungs, yet they live in the ocean. They manage by holding their breath and diving. Even penguins, which are birds, dive deep into the water to hunt. That is a fair point. Evolutionarily speaking, it is bizarre that no insects live in the sea. After all, life on Earth originally began in the oceans. Marine life evolved and eventually moved on to land. While transitioning from sea to land is highly complex, returning from land back to the sea should theoretically be much easier, since their ancestors already possessed the biological blueprints for marine life. They would only need to adapt backward. Does this mean insects originally came from the sea? Precisely. Insects share the same exoskeleton blueprint as crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, from which they evolved. Insects actually evolved from marine ancestors. So, the mystery is not why they never entered the sea, but why they can't seem to return. This is one of the greatest riddles in evolutionary biology. It feels like, with 1 million species evolving on land over millions of years, at least a few species would have successfully transitioned back to marine life. Why is there such a strict barrier? What is holding them back? One major theory is that crustaceans already occupy that ecological niche. How so? If their ancestors like crabs are already in the sea, wouldn't that make it easier for insects to adapt? While the marine food web has spaces where insects could theoretically survive, those roles are completely dominated by crustaceans. Because crustaceans already occupy these ecological niches, there is simply no room left for insects to break in. In other words, if insects try to colonize the ocean, they get outcompeted by the already established crustaceans. Exactly. but the precise mechanism of this competition is still being researched. Instead of purely ecological factors, another theory points to the physical constraints of the marine environment itself. What kind of constraint is that? This theory suggests that insects cannot grow their shells in the ocean. Why is that? Crabs seem to grow their hard exoskeletons just fine in the water. They are incredibly solid. Crustaceans can build hard shells because they absorb calcium directly from seawater. Their shells are primarily made of calcium, just like we need calcium to build strong bones. Seawater contains a high concentration of dissolved calcium. When their ancestors moved onto land, they faced a severe shortage of calcium. There is virtually no calcium in the air, and on land, it is locked up in rocks. So, what did insects do? They utilize the abundant oxygen in the atmosphere. Insects use an enzyme called MCO2 to react with atmospheric oxygen, chemically hardening their exoskeletons. So, marine crustaceans harden their shells with calcium, while land insects use oxygen. Each adapted beautifully to their respective environments. This oxygen-based exoskeleton is much lighter and more flexible, which is what allowed insects to develop wings and fly. Calcium shells are far too heavy for flight. However, this chemical difference is what keeps them out of the sea. Dissolved oxygen in seawater is extremely low, meaning insects cannot properly harden their oxygen-dependent shells. That explains the mystery. Couldn't they just switch back to using calcium like crabs do? If they did, they would have to compete directly with crustaceans. A soft, unhardened insect shell stands no chance against the heavily armored claws of a crab. However, in freshwater systems like rivers and lakes, insects do find a way. While some crustaceans like crayfish live in rivers, aquatic insects like giant water bugs and diving beetles can fly. By utilizing flight, they bypass the crustacean monopoly and thrive in freshwater. Ultimately, the ocean remains a hostile place for insects to grow and thrive. Even highly evolved lineages can't beat their ancestors on their home turf. Now, let's move to our final mystery. Why are insects attracted to artificial light? You might think they naturally fly in straight lines toward light. This behavior is known as phototaxis. It is widely believed that they mistake artificial lights for the sun or moon. Specifically, research suggests they are drawn to ultraviolet light. Insects can see UV light, which is invisible to humans, but the true reason for this behavior has long been misunderstood. Mistaking a light bulb for the moon is one thing, but why would flying toward it help them survive? It doesn't make much sense. If they truly wanted to fly toward the moon, they wouldn't spiral frantically around a light bulb. And if they were simply drawn to light, they would fly directly toward the sun during the day and burn to death. To solve this, researchers at Imperial College London, ICL, closely observed insect flight paths near light sources. They discovered 3 surprising facts. What did they find? First, they wondered how insects would behave if illuminated from below. Let's see what happens. Instead of flying toward the light, the insect flipped upside down and crashed. Next, what happens if the light is placed directly above them? The insect turns its back to the light and climbs upward. Finally, what if the light is on the side? The insect starts orbiting around the light. Do you notice a common pattern here? Let's analyze this behavior carefully. At first glance, it looks like they are trying to reach the light, but actually, the insect is always keeping its back to the light. Exactly. This behavior is called the dorsal light response. It's an instinctive reflex. Why do they have such a reflex? It's how they orient themselves in space. Larger animals use gravity to sense up and down, but for tiny insects, gravity is barely felt due to their low mass. Instead, they rely on the brightest light source, the sky, to identify up. By keeping their backs facing the light, they ensure they are flying right side up. Many fish in the ocean use the exact same reflex, since buoyancy makes it harder to feel gravity underwater. This reflex keeps them oriented relative to the sun or moon. With artificial light, the sky is suddenly below or to the side of them. By trying to keep their backs to it, they end up flipping, climbing, or orbiting. It only looks like they are attracted to the light. The mystery of phototaxis is actually an orientation issue. Their systems are simply tricked by artificial lights. They recognize light as the sky, but they don't understand that the light bulb is close to them. And that brings us to the end of our explanations. The more you learn about insects, the more fascinating they become. There are many other scientific theories out there, so feel free to look into them. When asked why he dedicated his life to studying insects, the famous entomologist Jean-Henri Fabre simply replied, "Because I don't have time to choose anything else." Insects offer an infinite field of study. Even creatures like cockroaches are masterpieces of survival engineering. Their tiny bodies contain some of nature's greatest designs. While some might find insects unpleasant, they represent the ultimate functional beauty of nature. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.